Good to be with you this morning. Certainly my family wants to thank all of you who came to our get-together for mother-in-law yesterday and for all the kindness and compassion that you have shown toward her. We appreciate that very much. Today I want you to think about one word: misunderstanding. What does that word mean? It means to have a mistake, an error. In the meaning of something that is said, written, or done. Now, all of you know, we live in a world of misunderstanding. Misunderstanding among individuals. Misunderstanding among the races. Misunderstanding among nations. And yes, misunderstanding in the religious world. Our world is full of misunderstandings, and sometimes it leads to hostility. Sometimes it even leads to conflict. And sometimes it even leads to war. The United States of America sent delegates to Mexico last week. Hopefully, some of the misunderstandings between Mexico and the United States of America, hopefully some of that's been cleared up. But misunderstandings can be very slight, or they can be very serious. If you are not familiar with faithful churches of Christ, I would like for you to understand that there are many misunderstandings concerning churches of Christ. You may have heard many things about the Church of Christ. And a lot of what you heard may not be true. In fact, in many cases, everything you've heard is not true. The purpose of this sermon is to attempt to make some matters clear that are often misunderstood. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. 1 Peter 3, verse 15. The Bible says, "Sanctify the Lord always in your hearts." To have a special place in each one of our hearts. "And be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh thee a reason for the hope that is within thee with meekness and fear." The word that is translated in English, the New Testament is translated from a Greek language. Be ready to give an answer. That's one word in the original language, apologia. And we translate that often apologetics. Now, an apology in our language means you regret something. Means you're sorry that you did or said something. Or at least you say that. We call that an apology. But that's not what it means in this passage. That's not what an apology meant in your New Testament. In your New Testament, the word apology meant a defense. So Peter tells Christians, always be ready to give a defense for the hope that is within you. Yet we must not do it with arrogance or rudeness. We must do it with meekness and fear, realizing that souls are at stake. My first point is found in Acts chapter 8, verse number 1. The book of Acts chapter 8, verse number 1. Stephen had been killed for preaching the truth, stoned to death. So you must understand that there are some people who will not accept truth. Some of those are among my brethren. We don't have a monopoly on sincerity. Some brethren cannot. Their hearts are so hard, they can't take truth. Many people, they have allowed their hearts to become so hard, they just can't take truth. So they kill this man in Acts 7. In the first part of the verse, they're talking about Stephen being killed for preaching the truth. But then the next part of the verse in Acts 8:1 says, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. Okay, what do you learn from this? You learn there was a congregation, there was a church in the city of Jerusalem. Acts 1:8 said it was all going to start in Jerusalem. So that's the original church. And there was a great persecution, Acts 8:1, against the church, which was at Jerusalem. Look at verse 3. Acts 8, verse 3. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church. Hailing men and women, committed them to prison. The word havoc in the King James Bible, in Acts 8:3, means to lay waste. Paul was laying waste to the church. How was he doing that? Going into the homes of brethren and carrying them off to prison. He was a persecutor of the church. And the church, of course, is not the building. It is God's people. You don't persecute buildings in Acts 8:1. You persecute the people. And that's what he was doing in Acts 8:3. 1 Corinthians 1. 1 Corinthians 1, verse number 2. Paul writes to the church of God which was at Corinth. Church of God is not a proper name, like we think of it in our culture. It just means the church that belongs to God. God's church. 1 Corinthians 1:2. He's writing to God's church. Was in the city of Corinth. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 2. In Romans 16:16, as Paul concluded that beautiful letter, he said, the churches of Christ salute you. Church of Christ here is not a proper name. In the original language, it simply means the congregations that belong to Christ. It's not a proper name. It's not a denomination. It just means the congregations that belong to Christ. Oftentimes in the New Testament, the church was just called the church. Sometimes it would have descriptive phrases to explain the nature of the church. Like Romans 16:16, churches of Christ. The churches that belong to Christ. The congregations in that area that belonged to Jesus. Last book in your New Testament, Revelation. Look at chapter 1, verse 4. John wrote to 7 churches in Asia. Now, what does that tell you? There were at least 7 congregations of the Lord's church in the ancient area of Asia. Now we call it Turkey. They called it Asia. Verse 11. Again, he mentions to them the 7 congregations that were in the area of ancient Asia. So the book of Revelation was written to several congregations who were in ancient Asia. Galatians 1, verse 2. Paul writes to the churches in Galatia. Galatia was a broad geographical area. There were several congregations of the Lord's church in Galatia, and he was writing to those congregations. My first point is there is a church in the New Testament. That is undeniable from these passages. There is a church in the New Testament. Now let me explain something to you. I was not, quote, reared in churches of Christ. I was reared in a prominent denominational church. So I understand how many of you feel who are not members of the Church of Christ, because I felt that way much of my life. And I also understand that what you believe is just as dear to you as what I believe. Maybe even more dear to you. So as we discuss these matters, I intend to keep that in mind. I intend to understand how you feel and how you think about the Church of Christ and denominationalism. I felt exactly the same way. So what I ask you to do, sit back, relax, take a deep breath, don't go to sleep, and just listen to what I have to say in the next few minutes. You may not agree with all of it. You may not agree with any of it. But at least maybe then you will understand where we are coming from in churches of Christ. Everything I say you must compare with the Bible. Acts 17 verse 11, these were more noble than those at Thessalonica, in it that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and they searched the Scriptures daily whether those things were so. You need to search the Scriptures to see if I'm telling you the truth. And if what I tell you is in the Bible and you reject it, it'll meet you in Judgment Day. But if what I tell you is not in the Bible then I tell you right now, reject it. So we establish the fact that there is a church that is mentioned over and over in the New Testament. And we only looked at a few of the passages. It's mentioned over and over and over. There's no doubt about it, there was a church in the first century. Now, what you have to understand, that was hundreds of years before any Catholic or any Protestant denomination ever existed. These came many years later. We're talking about the original church that began hundreds of years before the modern churches that we're all familiar with. Now, when you look into your New Testament and you look at this church, you will find that it is not the same as the churches of today. It's simply not. Even their leaders will admit this fact, that their churches are not the original church of the New Testament, that they admit that. So if they admit to us that they are not the church in the New Testament, that should mean a lot to us. Don't you think? This church in the New Testament was established by Jesus. Matthew 16:18, upon this rock I will build my church. Some of the first words Clint ever said was that passage. And he still remembers it. Dalton too. On this rock I'll build my church. Not my churches, not my denomination. I will build my singular church. So the church was built by Jesus. Second question. Why do churches of Christ exist? Why? Why are we here right now? What is our purpose? Surely we have a purpose. Surely we didn't just float in here. What's our purpose? Since there is a church in the New Testament, we can read about our purpose for existence is to reproduce that church in the New Testament in our culture and in our time in this city. That's why we're here. That's our reason for being here. Because the denominations of our day are not even similar to the church in the New Testament. It is not our intent to be another denomination. That's not our purpose for being here. There's plenty of those. And the word denomination itself means division, and that's condemned in the Bible. So you say, well, you think you're better than everybody else. No, I certainly do not. I do not think that. And most of the faithful members of the church, some of them do, but you got people on the mothership in every group. Most of my brethren, they don't think they're better than other religious people. We don't think that at all. No. The reason we have nothing to do with denominational churches and the reason we have no fellowship with them is not because we think we're better than them, because they're not the New Testament church. We're trying to get away from that. We're trying to get away from the churches of mere men and try to be the church in the New Testament. To do that, we have to separate ourselves from modern day religion. And that causes a lot of misunderstanding. Oh, you think you're better than everybody else? No. I don't. I know better. In fact, some of them act a lot better than some of us, if you want to get right down to it. In fact, some of them are more moral than some of us. Some of them are more kind and a lot more compassionate than many of us. So it's not that we're better. It's not that we even believe that. All we want to do is be the church in the New Testament right now. We want to reproduce that church. That's what we want to do. How are you going to do that? How are you going to reproduce the church in the New Testament? That's written a long time ago. How are you going to reproduce it? Well, I'm going to tell you right now, we cannot go by history and trace our lineage all the way back to the Jerusalem church. I'm telling you right now, we can't do that. We can't. But that's not necessary. That's not necessary. If we reproduce the same church that you find in the New Testament, we will be the same church. You don't have to find lineage all the way back to the Jerusalem church. But if we reproduce that church from the inspired description of that church given in the New Testament by God Almighty, we will be the same church. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's not easy. Some of you think it's easy. It's not. It's not an easy thing to do. How do you do that? Well, just think about it. How do you be the church in the New Testament and nothing else? You've got to believe what they believed. Look at Acts 2:42. Here's the early church. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, in breaking of bread and fellowship and in prayer. We have to believe the same doctrine they believed. Doctrine is vitally important. And we have to believe the same thing they believed. Not what our parents believed. Not what generations of the pioneers have believed. We have to believe what they believed in the New Testament church. We have to have the same doctrine. How do you reproduce the New Testament church? You got to be what they were. You not only have to believe what they believed, you have to practice what they practiced. Look at the love and the compassion that they showed for one another. Well, we got a long way to restore that. Wonder why you never hear that when we talk about restoring the church. Wonder why nobody wants to bring that up. We have to restore the love and the respect and the compassion they had for one another and for the whole world before we're going to be like them. Restore what they did. What did they do in the world? If we're going to be like they are, we're going to have to worship like they worshiped. It's not what I like. Oh, I just love to worship in this way. Well, that's real sweet. But is it the way the New Testament church worshiped? Do you worship like they worshiped? Their worship was instructed by God. They didn't go out and ask people, what do you want in worship? God told them how to worship. In every age in the Bible, God told His people how to worship. We got to worship like they worshiped. That's how you restore the New Testament church. When it comes to baptism, it's not what I think or you think or my parents think. We have to baptize people like they baptize people. You know how they baptize people? You won't find an instance where they baptize a baby. Not one time. You won't find it. When I became a member of the Church of Christ, my grandmother from the denomination drove 300 miles to straighten out Howell. She took me down to the beach, and she says, I want you to know what you've done is going to kill your mother. My mother's very sick. I don't want to kill my mother. She said, if you don't come back to the church this Sunday, your mother will die. That's a little tough. But then she said, what will it take to get you back? I said, you show me one verse in the Bible where they baptize babies, and I'll come back this Sunday. I'll walk down the aisle with you and admit I'm wrong. Well, it's in there. I said, all you got to do is show me. We went home, and she said to my granddaddy, show this boy where they baptized all those babies. My granddaddy talked real slow. He said, that's not in the Bible. You think it didn't get quiet at my house? Because nobody wanted to contradict him. In the New Testament, people who are lost in sin must turn from that sin and be immersed. That's the way they baptize people. That's the way we baptize people. That's the beginning. And you can begin right now. While we stand and sing.